So first thing I'd like to do is acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous guests that we have today. Welcome to the newly branded Macquarie Business School. I realised the budgeting didn't extend to those wonderful maps, and it's out there, isn't it, near the lifts, so that when you came off the lifts you saw Macquarie Business School. Wow. So welcome to the Macquarie Business School and the Applied Finance Centre's Finance Professional Series. It is my very, very great pleasure to introduce to you a dear friend of mine, Professor Ron Bird. Ron is one of those unique individuals who's able to navigate quite seamlessly, quite smoothly between academia and industry. Well, I've witnessed this, being at different places in both academia and industry, to see you make an impact. But started here at Macquarie University, which is a good sort of circular place to be here again. Yeah. After Macquarie Uni, of course at ANU, and moving into industry in regard to asset consulting and then investment management, both with Westpac and with setting up Grantham, Mayo Van Otterloo's operation in Australia. Moving back into industry at UTS, you set up the, I need to concentrate when I say the name of this centre, the Paul Woolley Centre for the Study of Capital Market Dysfunctionality, which is a favourite centre of mine, and now holds professorship roles here and Waikato. Also director of the investment management stream at Portfolio Construction Forum. Could you please join me in warmly welcoming Ron today?
I'm glad you got the applause at the beginning. If you don't mind, I'm going to sit down because my arthritis feels much better that way, so I might get to stand up later. Dan said most of it. I wanted to go through. I kind of retired, semi-retired at the end of last year, although I regard academia as retirement anyway, early retirement, so I really retired back in the 60s. But I had 40 years in universities and then 11 years outside in asset consulting and funds management. I went back to universities for several reasons. I didn't like work, and although funds management and stuff like that's not really work, I mean, you're not really carrying heavy things around and doing things like that. I also found funds management particularly boring, but I actually thought that it would be good to understand some things, and that certainly working is not a good place to learn to understand things, because whoever you're working for wants you to make money for them and not really stop and think too much. So the thing I went back to understand was how markets work. That was the thing that I really wanted to do. But along the way, I kind of became a bit more fascinated with really the funds management industry itself and the peculiarities of that. And that's what I want to talk about today. I gave this talk not that long ago at Oxford, because that was to largely academic, so there I used the other title for the paper, an expose of the funds management industry. But I thought I wouldn't use that title today, and so I guess I better start. First little bit will be background. I'm going to run through a few studies we've done, and I'm going to make some observations along the way, many of which won't be popular. I didn't read Dale Carnegie's book, but the good news is that I'm not the infallible member of the family. That she's at home, so most you can actually think most of the things that I observe you can think are wrong, and you may well be right on that. So this is what funds management does, and there's a lot of money flowing through around the world and a lot of profits made out of it. One of the things that did strike me was whether the structure of the funds management industry was right, that people give the money, they take all the risks, and they get the investment returns. And it seemed to me that they, in this particular instance, they're really providing the capital. And if they were debt holders, they'd get an interest rate. You might say that the moving in-house is actually a movement to what maybe is a more appropriate structure, where the people who in fact run the organisation and put the money in actually own the firm. So that's my first observation, and I think the structure is probably unfair. As I said, I didn't say, it's probably better to wait the 30 minutes before you start attacking me to get me get through. It's quite an interesting way the game has been set up. I think there's a lot of things that are different about the funds management industry, which makes it an interesting industry. And here, the way we've set the game up, we've and I put my hand up. I wrote the first mandate in this country, I believe, for UniSuper. VT reluctantly signed it. That we've really produced a game where, against the benchmark, you take bets against your benchmark, and if you win, somebody else loses, because effectively, as Sharp's pointed out, the arithmetic of active management, it's a zero-sum game the way we actually play it. So you have to find a loser to win, and then we don't think about the losers enough, and academics certainly don't. The question is, can people who are paid to do this for a living make money? And of course they can, if they're actually winning off some other people. What's interesting is, you might think the simplest or the most naive way of playing this game is to say every 6 months get some 20 darts and throw them at the Financial Review and buy the stocks and rebalance every 60 months. But what rate of return am I going to get if I do that? I'm not going to lose. I'm going to get the index return if I do it over a long enough time period. So, it's even not the totally naive investor of the people you're going to win off. You've got to find somebody worse than that to actually win off. Okay. And I think that's a particular characteristic we should think of when we're thinking of the industry. You may not agree with this, but since back Sharp, Lintner, Jensen and all that, when they made up their risk-adjusted performance measurement techniques and their papers, found as though they had to do an application, and what they showed back in there is that the thing they used as their benchmark in these studies, and they all had a benchmark of some type or other, actually beat most of the active managers, and that was really what kicked off index funds, actually. We continue to study this. I think, and this is what you might agree on, but in fact the overall evidence is that professional managers actually as a group don't outperform, and certainly don't after fees. And there's very little, and it doesn't matter if some outperform and some don't. In order to be able to identify a good one, you need one that persistently outperforms. And there's not a lot of evidence. When I was of persistence, when I was in consulting, I used to describe it as choosing managers and trying to hit a small but moving target, like going along to the county fair or something. The FT quote, which is now a few years old, is an interesting one, quoting it based on UK managers, where they say that the actual record of the manager would be not acceptable if produced in any other industry. Okay, but it's nice to quote from somebody else. Now, what is the purpose of fund managers? I don't know if any of you in the industry has actually thought of that. But in my mind, they serve two purposes. One is to make money for their clients, and we've really looked about that. The second one is to effectively make markets more efficient in an informational sense, result in better capital allocation, and therefore faster economic growth, and therefore increase the size of the pie. I quote there a couple of studies, one by Philippon and one and Malkiel. Malkiel will never come up with anything that's positive towards active managers, but the Philippon one is quite an interesting study. It says, despite a fold increase in expenditure in the industry in terms of the task of active management, and large increases in the cost of information processing, which you might think is another constraint. There's absolutely no evidence of pricing and marketing as having become more information efficient. In other words, the evidence on whether funds managers add to the efficiency of markets and therefore contribute to economic growth is also highly questionable. So those are what I would say the two things that managers do. They try and make money for their clients, and they try and effectively contribute to an increase in the wealth of the nation. So going on the other side of the cake, in terms of how much these people are paid, and when I look that up on Google, I get ridiculous figures of people being paid a couple $100,000. I mean, no one would get up out of bed for that in the morning, would they, for a start? But the interesting thing in this Philippon diagram, which cuts out, as you would say, before the financial crisis, although I don't think it's gone into reverse, shows that up to the 1980s, the people, this is not fund managers, but people in the financial services industry for the same level of qualification, experience, etc., got about the same as what the average manager got in other areas. And then you see it took off with Reagan, Thatcher, and free markets and stuff such as that, and went up to double. I mean, I know what cut I took to go back to universities, and it was about 70% I took a cut and told me to go back to university, shows you. It is a highly paid profession. Okay. Which gives me the source of my interest in the conundrum, which is raised there, that given the evidence on the contribution of fund managers, why are they in high demand and pay such extremely high salaries? And that's kind of the question I put. There was two elements to that question. I'm going to look at this one today. The other part of it is the question of why are they paid such high salaries, I think is an interesting question. I don't mean just fund managers, I mean people in the financial services industry. It's not evident to me why that's the case, but I mean, I think for everybody running Goldman Sachs, there'd be another 1,000 people out there who could do it at least equally as well, if not better. And therefore, there is people there to actually do the job. And so it's a wonder why the people at the top skim off so much of the profit. Now, so that's kind of what I want to talk about. And I've got some good news and bad news, in fact, in terms of my answers to that question. Some of the characteristics which I think is interesting, and you can deny this, but one of the distinguishing features of this industry, if not the most one, is that quality is almost impossible to measure. If you go back again to Bill Sharp made a statement, and I think based upon the volatility markets, that it's an industry in which you need 40 years of data to tell if anybody's any good at it. Right? And that's not bad, actually. As I say to my students, if you're not very confident, go into funds management. If you start at 20, you can retire at 60. You've earned a fair amount of money on the way, and only when you're leaving are they actually getting the idea of you're actually really good at the task or not. Second thing about it, and you may think that this is true, but the evidence supports is that funds are particularly sticky. You actually have to go to great efforts to actually lose money. Okay. So once you get in the door, it's an annuity type business. Once you get in the door, if you behave yourself, treat the clients nicely, money, I mean, when I was at Towers Perry, we actually did a study of how you get on a short list, how you get selected, and how you get fired. And you get on a short list because of performance, you get selected because they like you. That's why when you go and do road shows and things like that, you don't want to talk about how you manage money. You just want to build up empathy with the people. That's what gets you the money. So most of the marketing is misplaced in a lot of ways. But the third thing is you get fired because they don't like you, right? Not because you're losing them the money. That's the excuse they get because they're waiting for an excuse to fire you. And indeed, so that's why, I mean, back in the days when HSBC used to fund the Melbourne Cup and have the best tent at the Melbourne Cup meeting, I took ages and ages with Dunlop, who then themselves disappeared, right, getting them to actually fire HSBC as a manager because they were basically incompetent. It was easy to work that out. But and we passed it eventually at this is the super fund. But then the chief financial officer rang up and said, we can't fire them. The Melbourne Cup's coming out, and they're going to coming on, and they're going to send out all the invitations. And you only need 2 events 6 months apart that everybody wants to go to, and it's almost impossible to get fired, as long as you don't lose 10% per annum for 5 years. I mean, a funds management is somebody managing your money for them to when there's none left, right? And it's the best industry in which to be an agent. Okay, and I want to speak for principal agency theory for about 30 seconds. We use agents. We've all probably used lots of agents already today. That's how life involves around using agents, right? And why do we use agents? Because we haven't got the skill or the time to do it ourselves, right? There's a lot of talk about how you actually minimise the wealth transfers from the agents to the principals, monitoring and bonding type costs. But there's 2 characteristics of this industry that makes it unique. And I must pass. I mean, this I learnt from David Hare. I don't know if you ever saw David Hare's play on the great financial crisis, but buying the script of that book actually was one of the best investments I ever made. But 2 things about the industry. One is it deals in money. Now, there's no saturation. If I work in a brewery and I want to drink beer, I mean, I can only drink a certain amount of beer before I just don't want any more, right? So we're in an industry where we don't suffer from saturation. The second one, and particularly in Australia, is we're in an industry where the majority of the people who own the money don't give a damn, right? With compulsory superannuation, there's no reason. I mean, we know they don't get involved till when they're in about 50, right? But there's no reason to. They can't do anything about the money being taken out of their salary, and they can't actually access the funds. So it'd be ridiculous for them people to actually waste their time being too interested in what to do. A disinterested principle is, in fact, the best case. So I would maintain that, particularly in the financial services industry and in funds management in particular, if I was going to be an agent, I would only be an agent in that area. Now, faced with, as I said, going back to the conundrum, this goes back, as Dan said, to the Centre for the Study of Capital Market Dysfunctionality, by the way, which we started off before the DFC, and we had centres in LSE, where it still exists, Toulouse and UTS, funded by Paul Woolley, an ex-fund manager who must have felt he had to do, he got all these gains and he should put them to some purpose. So I've done a few studies which I want to talk about, and given the time, and for about the next 10 minutes is probably all we can do, and make some conclusions. But I summarise there some of the major findings. I mean, the thing I found is that active managers are good at designing an investment process, right? And they're also good at identifying mispriced stocks, but only a small number of them. Why doesn't this lead to greater profit? Well, first, it's a greater return. Well, firstly, and this is something I said back in 1990, they used to customise benchmarks like small cap value or whatever. But as people follow different investment processes, we continue to produce investment benchmarks, which effectively took away from them the work they'd done in designing the process. And all we measure then is the implementation of the process, not the design of the process. And that's what we're doing. And I'll show you some numbers on this at the moment. Now, implementation is where I find they don't add value, but they actually do a good job in designing the process in the first place as a group. So one of the reasons they don't appear to add value is because, as I said, the way we measure their performance against customised benchmarks effectively takes something away. The second reason is, of course, that we hold far too many stocks in our portfolios, and a majority of those are stocks which in fact underperform. But if we just stuck ourselves to the ones that we like best, then we would do a lot better. And I'll show you some evidence on that, at least for Americans. Some math. I won't talk about this. I'm going to use a concept in this which comes from Kremers and Petejewski, and that's the measure of active bets, right? So the active, if you have 2% in the stock and it's 1% in the index, that's a 1% active bet, right? Your active bets have obviously got to add up to 0. What they did was add up the absolute value of all the active bets and divide by 2. If you hold the index, then you got the active bet 0. If you hold no stocks in your benchmark at all, then it's going to be 100%. But that's a concept I'm going to use. This study's, and that's what the next slide says. The study's done on US data up to a few years ago because we're using mutual fund data. But turning to the first thing, well, this is the only slide I want to put up on. What I've done here is to separate the total return into the style choice and the implementation. As I said, this is really the added value by, in fact, the design of the process. This is the added value by the implementation of the process. You can see across all funds that there's a 1.4% per annum outperformance due to designing a process other than just simply investing in the market, or an index fund in the total market. The implementation is 0, right? And this is all before fees. You can see that, well, the rest of the story is what you'd expect because I've broken up into weak and strong markets, growth and value. But simply the point I want to make there is by using customised benchmarks, we actually take away the added value that a manager brings to the table by the design of their process. And that's one thing they're good at as a group. Now, the second paper I want to talk about is looking at stock selection skills of managers and particularly talking about diversification. I mean, when I left universities, there were 3 things I thought I believed in: portfolio theory, capital asset pricing model, and the efficient market hypothesis. Slowly through time, I began to learn that the capital asset pricing model wasn't worth the paper it was written on, as an empirical test. Sorry, Tom. And secondly, the markets were certainly not efficient. I mean, and I believe they are getting less efficient through time, actually. And I've said many years ago that the US market was the least efficient market, at least going into the global financial crisis. Now, I still left me with Markowitz and portfolio theory and diversification. But the thing, and which has become kind of accepted, undiversified portfolios, it's embedded in legislation, it's embedded in the law, it's embedded everywhere. But the thing that we forget is that only makes sense if markets are efficient. There's no point adding portfolio assets onto your portfolio if they're going to actually reduce your return. Remember, as we hold more and more stocks, the incremental reduction in risk is very, very marginal. If you add the best stocks first, then you're going to get positive return, you're going to get some reduction in risk. You soon reach a point where actually it's costing you money because you might be getting a 0.0001% reduction in risk and giving up 0.5% in return or something. But so diversification is not really all it's made out to be. To actually get some other people agreeing with this, I think, and these I do believe are 3 of the greatest men. I mean, if you want to learn anything about investing, then read Keynes's General Equilibrium book, which I haven't read right through, I must admit, either. But and then we have Buffett, and probably maybe a better investor than Buffett, Charlie Munger. But I like Buffett's statement. I like both of them. As Buffett says, diversification is a protection against ignorance. Okay? And just to balance it out, Munger said academics have done a terrible disservice to intelligent investors by glorifying the idea of diversification. So the whole concept is literally almost insane. So let's have a look at what we did and some of the results. What we did was we actually got because we only get quarterly data in terms of these holdings data, we actually ranked the holdings by the size of the bet, right, against the index. So if you had 5% in this portfolio and it was 2% in the index, that's 3. So we ranked them, for each manager, we ranked them from the highest to the lowest obviously being negative. And then we built portfolios on these best bets, okay, across effectively all the managers. And I wondered what we would get, but we got something quite startling, I think, in this. This is the column, I think, the annualised net returns, because we then actually adjusted for the transactions costs. So these are after transactions costs. And that's the return on across the managers for the top five holdings, 12.75%. By the way, their index did about 9, right? And the managers did about 10. So, and you can see as you got this is the top 5. The next 5 it went down to 9.85, 9.26, 8.62, 8.25. By the way, you should be comparing that against about 9. What it proved is that managers are good at selecting stocks, but they actually ran out of steam between about 15 and 20. What's the medium-sized holding of a US equity mutual fund? 87, right? So a lot more than 15. One of the reasons for the manager's performance is that they can pick stocks, but they dilute that by, in fact, putting in a lot of stocks, maybe in the interest of diversification, which in fact dilute the performance of their best stocks. By the way, there's a lot of things doing that. One of the reasons why, which is leads to this, is, well, A, because managers might be told in their mandates that they have to hold a certain number of stocks, but also the way that we now get to play the game with tracking errors actually means that if you're going to stay within a reasonably tight tracking error, you've got to hold a lot of stocks you just don't like, right? If you didn't like the banks in Australia, but you want a tracking error of 2 or 3, you've got to have still a huge investment in the banks to actually stay within it. So the way we've defined the game has in fact moved us towards this type of behaviour. By the way, it's also true as I said, with the initial benchmarks, and this was again for UniSuper, we had one manager come in each time and certainly hugged the benchmark, and we said, no, we're paying you to be an active manager. He said, I didn't realise that. And he went away, and he came back 6 months later, and he still was hugging the benchmark. I mean, it's business risk too, and we'll see a bit more about that in a couple of minutes. So, I mean, that's another issue. Certainly managers spend most of their time in funds management operations on stock picking, right? Not portfolio construction, but stock picking. And they'll actually display a talent for doing it. But it's very limited. Now, what I tried to do here was say, well, rather than put your money with diversified managers, you take the best bets from managers and across a lot of managers. And if you're going to compare, and this was done by Monte Carlo simulation, if you're going to do that, I mean, that's what you get. This is what you get from just putting your money with diversified managers. That's by diversifying across the managers on their best bets, and it's not much difference, right? It doesn't bring you a lot more. But then you've got to remember what what Buffett said. If you're any good, then you shouldn't diversify, right? What I'm doing in this study is, in fact, this was across all the equity managers. If I do it for the better equity managers, I get this type of result. Their best bets do about 18.6, and they can hold about 40 stocks before they run out of ones which in fact outperform. But that's if actually you're good, okay? And that gets back to Buffett's point. If you're no good, diversify. If you are good, don't diversify because you're throwing money away. But probably with lower business risk. Okay. Final one of these papers. I'll try and be quick. This is different. This is kind of this is a bit more theoretical, although we've got some empirical content in it. It was kind of looking at the behaviour of managers, assuming managers' aim in life is to maximise the value of the management organisation, which we took as managing the present value of future dividend income. What will they do? Now, their decision variable was how much money to put in their best portfolio and how much money to put into their benchmark, right? I mean, obviously, if you were totally aggressive, you'd put all your money in your best risky portfolio. If you weren't wanting to take any risks at all, then you would put all the money in the benchmark. So the decision variable is how much money I put into my risky portfolio. Okay. Now the game.
Ron, can I just ask a question about the top 5 picks? When you said their best bets, did you mean the bets where they had the, and I might have missed.
Yeah, no, the highest, where they took the biggest bet against their benchmark, in absolute terms. In absolute terms.
Active exposure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I didn't think it would work quite as well as it did, but you can see it was very monotonic. Now, the game is, well, let's forget this. This is some stylized facts we wanted to meet. This is showing that the first one here is on boutiques, and it shows that as they get older, they invest in more stocks and take less risk and get lower returns. This is on international. This is Russell data. This is international. The small ones get a much better performance than the big ones, etc. But that's kind of stylized facts we wanted to back out of the study we were doing. Now, let me go to the picture. What we assume is we've got a manager that starts off now. We assume that if over 3 years he beats the benchmark, he or she meets the benchmark by more than a certain percentage, they get paid off. It's right, they get funds coming in, right? If they underperform for over the same period by a certain amount, and these don't have to be equal, the threshold at the bottom and the top can be quite different, they in fact lose money. Now you think of yourself as a boutique. I think when we started MIR, Michael gave us $20 million of his money to lose. Unfortunately, we didn't. But what was our C? What was our cost? Almost zero, like when you start with no managers. The payoff at the top is, in fact, G is much bigger than C for a manager starting its life with not a lot of money. Okay. So we ran that. We ran that kind of game by looking at various different values for G and C to determine how much would we put in our risky portfolio. And this is kind of it here. Let me take this one. This is where C, that's C down there. C is just a numeraire. G and C are just numeraires. That 0.0254. This is for G equals 0.1, right? So here, for instance, G equals 0.1 and C equals I guess it's 0.1, 10 times. The gains are 10 times the risk. And obviously, I'm going to take, I put nearly 60% of my money in the risky portfolio. By the time it gets down to here, and that is G equals 0.1 and C equals 0.09, I in fact, there's no incentive for me to in fact take any risks at that stage. Okay. In fact, it's a bit before 0.1 and 0.1, in other words, when G equals C, just simply because there are certain risks involved, and we're assuming the manager is risk averse, by the way. Okay. But you can see up here, I mean, here's a much bigger G's. We invest, when G's have got greater than C, then we invest a lot in the risky asset. Oh, by the way, in that we assumed the alpha of the manager in that was 0. In other words, the alphas of the manager was 0. He had, and this is the holy grail. In that case, that is his long-term alpha. If he managed money for 50 years, he'd get 0. Here we're now varying. Is that? Oh, I haven't moved to the next one. Here we've got alphas on the bottom line. Right. That's the long-term value added of the manager. If they manage money for a long period of time, they outperform by 3%. Here's 2%. Now you can see, providing G is a fair bit greater than C, even if your alpha is -2, you would still take reasonably sized bets, right? In fact, this is an industry. I'll get to another point. If your alpha was -2%, and given the volatility of equity markets, there's a 1 in 3 chance that you would outperform the index over 3 years by 6% in total, right? Now, 6% outperformance in the index over 3 years is going to get you money, right? And that's if your alpha is really 0.2. So a second observation is, just because you're no good at it is not a reason for not being a fund manager. Right? It's one of the industries where that is just true. And indeed, what should you do in that case? Well, here what I've done is worked out what the bet size should be for people as they grow larger. As they grow larger, good managers should have a lot of money in the active portfolio when they've got very little money to manage, right? Bad managers a lot less, but still significantly large. As they get larger mid-cycle, as they get bigger, you can see the good managers should become an index fund. Because in fact, C becomes a lot bigger than G. C becomes a lot bigger than G. And because, although some people deny it, the bigger you are, it's harder to actually generate alpha. If you're a bad manager and you hit pay dirt, then you should quickly you should go down to becoming a closet indexer, which would keep your money. The only problem about being a closet indexer is how do I appear to be active? If I have an active bet of 0, for instance, but there's many ways of actually neutralising all your bets but appearing to be active. Okay, so you can appear to be active, but in fact give up taking bets. Now, so some more observations, I guess. So let me move on to some of the implications. What I've been really talking about here are principal agency problems between clients and managers. Okay, and the one here is in fact that the manager, by trying to maximise the value of his operation, will in fact behave in a way which is not using his skills to the best interests of his clients. Okay, that's what I haven't looked inside it, but the same problem, the internal problems. If you're a fund manager in a firm which grows large, and it's in the interest of the fund manager to pull in their bets to a large extent, and you're good, then there are conflicts within it, and that's why a lot of people leave funds management organisations which have grown big, because their potentiality for showing how good they are, and maybe even making money, depending on how they're remunerated, is decreased. So that really is a reason for a lot of growth in boutiques. One thing that we don't show in here, as I said, one reason I left funds management or consulting was that I thought that I was doing more damage than good. In fact, that's been true in most of the industries I've been in. But when we actually run this game on excess return and tracking error versus total return and total volatility, what we find is, and I'll have to take my word for it, that the effect on diluting the behaviour of managers is much less if we work on total returns rather than excess returns. In other words, the existence of the mandates has a bigger impact of actually reducing the ability, the willingness of managers to use their skills than if in fact we use total returns and total risk as the benchmark. Now this is kind of a bad thing. I mean, I always found that, why we had mandates was because we went to all this trouble of selecting managers, but then we said, we don't trust you, so we're going to put cufflinks on you, so in fact you can't lose too much of our money, right? And then we had, but what I found fascinating is then we had among all these guys called hedge funds, who we said, take all our money and fees, we don't need to know what you do, and go out there and do it. So it seemed to me that we had a new group of people who came down from Mars or something who we did trust, whereas often they were the same people we hadn't trusted 12 months earlier when they were actually working in a long-only manager. Okay. Where we go? So this is the end. What I've done to my own benefit, actually, I've come to a better understanding of why managers get paid a lot of money, because a lot of them are good at what they do, but the way that we play the game means that not a lot of that will, not a lot of that skill will actually translate into better returns for their clients. Okay. As I said, a key feature of it is that it's the luck skill ratio in terms of outcome. And I know, I mean, one of the problems with fund managers is, I mean, as I said, if it takes 40 years to identify yourself as good, then self-actualisation doesn't come to many of us, right? We're not regarded as being good at what we do, as we might be in other industries if we even an architect or something like that. Okay, so one of the things you've got to substitute is money for self-actualisation, I guess, to a certain extent. But it has its benefits, as I pointed out, by not being able to identify how good you are. Another interesting thing is, if you think of the game, and this may be when the Productivity Commission says, well, we'll get all the money into the hands of good managers, my question is, well, who are they going? They might actually have performed well in the past, but who are they going to win against if they represent so much of the market, right? It's an industry where, in fact, you may be better off paying bad managers to stay in the game so that you can actually be good. Because the way the game, if all the bad managers went, good managers couldn't outperform. Okay. The introduction of mandates and benchmarks has worked to the disadvantage of investors, I would say. And finally, if you're going to work as an agent, then there's only one industry to be in. So a lot of you have probably already made it, so congratulations, whether you got there by design or good luck. It's interesting to say, when you actually interview someone for funds management, and Jack's written about this, because I'm writing with Jack a book on the past, present and future of funds management. Right? But, I mean, what are the skills you actually look for in a manager? I mean, what are the things which separate them out? I think that's kind of it. I won't bore you with that. This was a little bit on how you actually identify better managers. The one thing I'd say on that is, the actual things, there's been a lot of work on looking at characteristics of managers and how that correlates with performance. And the thing that comes out of it is the managers who think they're better are better, right? Now, I found there's a bit of a conundrum because I've always found, particularly back in the consulting days, that managers really didn't know where they stood in the pecking order very much at all, actually. But what I'm saying here is the managers who are willing to run first with things, take bigger bets, both in terms of style and whatever, bigger active bets is what actually are the ones which get the better performance. So I think a good way of actually better than looking at past performance of managers, looking at their willingness to have a go, I think is a good way of actually determining which are the better managers to look at. Of course, that willingness to have a go will disappear if you believe my previous paper, which suggests that when you've got your $3 billion, at 50 basis points or something, then just be satisfied with that as an annuity for life. And it's not bad. It generates a fair bit of money. Okay, so here we go. That's thank you for your tolerance.